The Himalayas, in all their magnificent beauty, have long been regarded as the traditional abode of the gods. It was to this lofty perch that man prayed and received the multiple benefits that only nature can provide.
जंगल की जिंदा पैदावार ऑक्सीजन है, प्राणवायु, और फिर उसके बाद पानी है, फिर उसके बाद मिट्टी है, फिर उसके बाद खाना है, फिर उसके बाद पशुओं के लिए चारा है, फिर उसके बाद कपड़ा है, फिर उसके बाद औषधि है, फिर उसके बाद छाया है। ये तो हैं जंगल की जिंदा पैदावार। और जब पेड़ मर जाए, जंगल ख़त्म हो जाए, तो उसके बाद ईंधन और इमारती लकड़ी है।
At least that is what the Himalayan forests used to provide. Forest resources are the critical ecological elements in the vulnerable Himalayan ecosystem. The natural broad-leaved and mixed forests have been central in maintaining water and soil stability under conditions of heavy seasonal rainfall. They have also provided the most significant input for sustainable agriculture and animal husbandry in the hills. Green leaves and grass satisfy the fodder requirement of the farm animals, whose dung provides the only source of nutrients for food crops. Dry twigs and branches are likewise the only source of domestic cooking fuel. Agricultural implements and house frames require forest timber. Forests also provide large amounts of fruit, fibers, and herbs for local consumption. To do their job effectively, the Himalayas must be clad in forest up to 60% of their surface. Today, even in the best preserved areas such as Himachal, the ratio is down to 18%.
The Himalayan region is an extremely sensitive area, very fragile. The Western Ghats, the Eastern Ghats, these are all areas, hill areas, which are the sources of most of the perennial streams. And if deforestation takes place there, as it has in a catastrophic way over the years, then I think we are asking for trouble, and this is exactly the genesis of the whole problem in the country, where the deforestation has led to the annual cycle of floods and droughts.
In his bid to conquer nature, man has left a path of destruction in his wake. Through hundreds of kilometers of foothills, up to 6,000 feet, there is hardly a tree left standing. There have been many causes which have contributed to this. In the early 60s, massive road building was undertaken in difficult and dangerous terrain without proper scientific planning. The roads ruined the terraced fields and caused devastating landslides such as this. And then there are the quarries. Forest land once replete with wildlife are now mostly bare of both trees and topsoil. Work at the quarries is random and uncontrolled, and so tree coverage, loose rocks and other debris are swept down by the monsoon rain down the age-old watercourses and rivers. Once, these trees worked as a protective mantle to the Himalayas, enriching the topsoil by their thick falling leaves. But the trees are cleared not just because of roads and quarries, but because they themselves are needed. Paper and furniture are just amongst many industries that require wood. Today, demand outstrips supply. Naturally, this causes a problem, and a confrontation is inevitable when the needs of the local people in the hills must give way to the nation's demands for commercial timber. One of the outcomes was the Chipko Movement. The Chipko Movement was born one morning in March 1973 near the remote hill town of Gopeshwar in Chamoli district.
The immediate provocation for the Chipko Movement was the decision by the Forest Department to allot a plot of broad-leaved forest to a sports good company, and that same plot of forest had been refused to be allotted a few months earlier to a local cooperative, that the Soligram Swarajya Sangh, which wanted to make agricultural implements for villagers. So this blatant act of injustice sparked off the first so-called Chipko movement.
Chipko means literally to embrace, and that is what the villagers did. When the contractors arrived with their men to fell the trees, the villagers hugged them, and the cutters had no choice but to leave empty-handed. But the genesis of the Chipko movement has both an ecological and an economic background. The Alaknanda Valley, in which the movement originated, was the scene of an unprecedented flood in 1970. The tragic aftermath of this flood left a deep impression on the hill folk, and with it soon followed the appreciation of the vital ecological role that forests play in their lives.
लकड़ा सबको चूल्हे पर लगता है, मानुष मरे तो उसको लगता है, ऐसी झोपड़ी बनाती है, कोई अलग लकड़ीशिवाय काम होताच नाहीये.
Over the years, the villagers had also seen and resented the manner in which successive governments, beginning with the British, had taken away their forest wealth and turned it into a resource bank for faraway urban markets. Even for minor forest produce and articles of daily necessity like firewood, the local people had been forced to become thieves in their own homeland. The Chipko movement greatly helped to unite the people and focus attention on the mismanagement of forest resources.
Chipko is essentially a peasant movement for access to subsistence rights. And one quote from a peasant in Badiargarh illustrates this. When I asked him, why did you join the Chipko movement? He said, हमें थोड़ा सा अनाज मिलता है, जब उसे भी पका नहीं सकते तो आंदोलन करना पड़ा. Because of deforestation, our fields yield very little. When we didn't get wood even to cook this amount, we had to resort to a movement. So it's a movement for basic economic needs, basic needs. That's how it should be seen.
It was these economic needs which often led the villagers into direct confrontation with the forest department officials, who they charged with corruption and connivance with local contractors in the felling of trees, which they feel exists even today.
Corruption maybe to some level there may be, but I won't say that people are basically corrupt, but our subordinate staff, our lower staff, at times they are forced into it because of the situation in which, because of the environment in which they are working. Like I'll just say that our lowest rank man who protects the forest is a forest guard, who lives all alone in the forest with nothing to protect himself and with nobody around him. His family is somewhere else. He is living under very hard conditions. And so if he has nothing to protect himself, like police has arms but he doesn't have any, he has no protection for himself. So at times, if he is forced to connive, say there are people at present, there are gangs working with arms, there are, especially this problem has not arisen so far in the hills to that extent, but in the Tarai belt there are so many mafia gangs working, and I don't think a man without any protection will be able to guard the forest. So I think if he is corrupt at times, he has been forced, the situation, the environment has forced him to become corrupt.
According to the Forestry Department, who is charged with the protection of reserve forests, only dead trees are allowed to be felled. If that is the case, we were certainly surprised by the number of dead trees collected for transportation in the forest near the Binsar Sanctuary in Almora district.
It is, the reserve forest area is only about 40% in this particular district, while 60% of the area is either civil panchayati or individual NAP lands. So if some deforestation takes place in the civil area or in the panchayati area over which the forest department has no control, I don't think the forest department should be blamed for that. The general impression is whenever a tree is felled, it is taken to be the forest department's property, while that is not the case.
Demand for timber has also led to another dangerous development, monoculture, or the growing of a single species, usually pine. The fine needle-like leaves of the tree do not provide the essential sponge effect of the mixed forests, and so small streams and rivers dry up for increasingly long periods because the monsoon rains run off too fast. But what can the forestry department do? In 20 years, the demand for commercial timber is expected to go up by 139%. Another aspect taken over by the forestry department is the tapping of resin. It was said that the contractors were over-tapping the trees, sacrificing the forest's long-term interests for short-term gains. But that, it seems, still goes on.
चिपको आंदोलन से पहले फॉरेस्ट विभाग का जैसे प्लानिंग विभाग से कोई मतलब ही नहीं था. तो चिपको आंदोलन चलने से फॉरेस्ट विभाग को लाजमी, जहाँ तक उत्तर प्रदेश का सवाल है, एक एडीओ वन नियुक्त करना पड़ा और एक नई पोस्ट निकालनी पड़ी, जिससे कि आज कम से कम फॉरेस्ट विभाग को ये तो लगने लगा है कि पब्लिक के साथ या प्लानिंग के साथ हमको जुड़ के काम करना है.
Over the years, the Chipko movement has acquired two distinct streams of thought, marked by its two leaders. Chandi Prasad Bhatt, who pioneered the movement, is from Gopeshwar. Bhatt is essentially a grassroots worker who believes mainly in organizing the people and has little time for public relations. On the other hand, Sunderlal Bahuguna, who is from Siliara in the Tehri region, has focused mainly on spreading the message of Chipko far and wide and is fiercely ecological in approach.
I think Sunderlal Bahuguna takes that vein in Gandhi, which rejects modern civilization completely and calls for a return to a pre-colonial and pre-capitalist village community. Whereas Bhatt, I think, is more pragmatic, and he seems to argue that we can't reject modernity, but we can certainly reject some of its more unpalatable features. One aspect about Bhatt's work, which in addition to regeneration, which should be mentioned, is his work in energy-saving devices, which in fact would reduce the demand on the forest. Well, one way of checking deforestation is afforestation, regeneration. Another way is implementing energy-using devices such as smokeless chulas, fuel-efficient chulas, biogas plants, and also some work he's done on microhydro projects. Now, this work of his is not very well known, and it's unfortunate because I think this has a great deal of potential, and it has not got as much support either from the environmental movement or from government agencies as it could.
पेड़ अगर नहीं कटेगा, पब्लिक को अगर उसकी ज़रूरत के लिए कुछ भी नहीं दिया जाएगा, तो फिर पब्लिक तो इससे जुड़ेगी नहीं, टूटेगी, क्योंकि पब्लिक की आम ज़रूरत के लिए यहाँ पर ऐसा भी नहीं है कि कोई मकान बनाने के लिए सीमेंट, कंक्रीट या लोहे के दरवाजे ये कितने महंगे पड़ते हैं। तो यहाँ पर आम आदमी अपनी ज़रूरत के लिए और ईंधन के लिए, अब हमारी सरकार तो ये कहती है कि गैस देंगे आपको जलाने के लिए, लेकिन जिस गरीब के पास हमारे यहाँ पर रात को ओढ़ने के लिए कपड़ा नहीं है, वो तो आग ही सेक के रहेगा ना, तो उस गैस का क्या करेगा। तो जंगलों से उपज का कुछ न कुछ हिस्सा तो पब्लिक को देना ही होगा, तभी पब्लिक या जनता वनों की रक्षा करेगी।
The Chipko movement has disappointed some of its early admirers because it has remained so stubbornly local. But the philosophy that underlies it has spread from Himachal to Arunachal, and in all these areas, small local activist groups have taken up the challenge of conservation.
Conservation and the needs of the local people influenced Mukti Datta to start the Paryavaran Jan Jagran Samiti in Almora district.
What we've done is to try and have as much of the village wastelands and the areas and the revenue lands around the villages under forest cover plantations of local fodder and fuel species, which we've started on this year, this monsoon. And hopefully in 5 years' time, the plantations would be ready for the use of the villagers. And in Kumaon, there's a very unique system called the Van Panchayat, which doesn't exist, to the best of my knowledge, anywhere else. So these plantations would come under the Van Panchayats, and the villagers would therefore have control over the areas they've planted. And so the pressures on the sanctuary would then be reduced, because the women who walk for 20 kilometers uphill to collect fuel and fodder, they feel that if the fuel and fodder is available close by, it would be greatly beneficial to them. And so I feel that in maybe 5 or 6 years, this could be worked out. But of course, initially compromises will have to be made, and one can't have absolute safety and shut out the forests like that at the drop of a hat.
Unquestionably, the real strength of the movement are the women whose daily lives and needs are directly affected by the forests.
ऐसा है कि यहाँ पर परंपरा से महिलाएं ही खेती का काम करती थी, पुरुष जो है बाहर चले जाते हैं, क्योंकि यहाँ पर जो है यहाँ की अर्थव्यवस्था मनियार्डर की अर्थव्यवस्था है। यहाँ पर कोई इस तरह के न उद्योग थे और न साधन थे कि लोग यहाँ पर थोड़ा बहुत परिवार चलाने के लिए कोई पैसा अर्जित कर सके। तो पुरुष को लाजमी दिल्ली, बम्बई या बड़े शहरों में या मिलिट्री में नौकरी करने जाना होता था, तो महिलाएं ही यहाँ पर काम करती थी। इसलिए जो है महिलाओं पर ही इसका कार्य का सारा भार था।
Motor roads, which have replaced footpaths, provide the menfolk an easy exit route to the big world outside and to more lucrative jobs. They return to their villages only 2 or 3 times a year, usually to help with the sowing and harvesting. The rest of the time, it is the women who must look to the land. For these women, a typical day begins at sunrise. To begin with, there are numerous household chores to attend to before the women can go about their daily task of collecting fuel for cooking and fodder for their cattle. The children are either left at home or sent to school.
10 बजे जब बच्चे स्कूल जाते तो हम भी जंगल जाते, तब जिस समय बच्चों की हाफ टाइम होती 1 बजे उस समय हम भी घर आते। दोपहर का हम ऐसे कहते हैं कि हमारे गाय रहते हैं, भैंस रहती है, उनको पानी पिलाया, उनका गोबर निकाला, कहीं पेड़ काट के लाते हम इधर उधर से, उनको खिलाते, बच्चों को आके बच्चों को खिलाते, तो हम दोबारा जंगल जाते हैं। जब हमारे जंगल नजीक हो गए तो हम दोबारा जाते जंगल।
For these women, the forest is indispensable. Deforestation means longer, strenuous daily excursions to meet their basic needs for fuel and fodder. As a result, Chipko activists organize camps in various villages to create awareness regarding forest conservation. The participants are mainly women.
इन कैंपों में क्या होता है, आप क्या सीखते हैं इन कैंपों से?
वैसे कहते हैं कि ऐसे पेड़ लगाओ और ये भीड़ पगार नहीं, वो गिरे, हमारे पहाड़ में बहुत बारिश आती है ना, तो टूट फूट बहुत हो जाते हैं, खेत बहुत टूटते हैं, तो वैसे पेड़ लगाने से कहते हैं कि खेत भी रुक जाएगा, ऐसे टूटेगा नहीं।
पहले तो ऐसे करते थे बहन जी, जब लकड़ी के लिए चल गए तो नीचे से फेंक देते थे। अब हम ऐसे नहीं सोच रहे कि हम ऐसे सोच रहे हमारे पेड़ जितना हमारा जंगल बनेगा उतना हमारा फायदा होगा, हम ऐसा सोच रहे। हम काजी पेड़ों को किसी को नहीं तोड़ देते, या तोड़ने देते हम किसी को नहीं।
Still, for most villagers, it is difficult to view the aims of a movement like Chipko in the broader spectrum of conservation. They see it as a time-saving device to procure fuel and fodder. Many villages have their own nurseries where the local people are involved in raising saplings and seeing them to maturity. Local activists see this as one way of tackling the problem of afforestation, to encourage people to grow more trees on their land. However, by an act of 1977, these very trees would require the permission of the Forest Department to be cut down.
For instance, in one village, there's a man who's got a nursery and he's planted 1 lakh saplings in this nursery. And he cut down 2 dead trees near his house, 2 dead thun trees, and used them to construct his cow shed and for domestic purposes. So the Forest Department got very angry and they filed a case against him. But the case has now gone very much in his favor because he's argued that, look, I've cut down 2 trees, but I've planted 1 lakh.
It depends upon how we look at the area. What is the policy of the government? If government wants more revenue from a certain resource or an asset, it gives directions and the departments work accordingly. And whenever the stress changes, the outlook changes, the departments also change. Like till very recently, the major objective of the forest department was to earn revenue. Now it has changed and we are now trying our level best to protect and to increase the forest. And now the stress is more on environmental aspect of the forest.
अब हमारी इतनी वृक्षारोपण की योजनाएं चल रही है ना, अब इन योजनाओं में तो बहुत कुछ खर्चा तो इंतजाम करने वालों को आ जाता है। ये अफसर रखो, वो अफसर रखो, और ये बिल्डिंग बनाओ, और ये जीप खरीदो, सारा का सारा ये सब खर्चे बंद करके और सीधे लोगों को सौंप दो, गांव के लोगों को कहो कि फी 100 पेड़ तुमको इतना देंगे साल के आखिर में, हमको पेड़ पैदा करके दिखा दो, और बाकी जितनी ज़मीन है उसका उपयोग की योजना बनाएं।
One of the solutions favored by many is the tree patta system, whereby the local people would be given greater control over forest land and thereby share in the produce. This responsibility would give them added motivation and incentive to protect what they would now regard as their trees.
The tree patta scheme potentially is a very imaginative and far-reaching program. It could not, and not just, its application is not just restricted to the Himalaya. It could perhaps make a massive dent in the problem of unemployment and underemployment in rural areas, apart from, while simultaneously greening bare slopes.
At least I have some reservation about the patta system to the extent because, as you know, India is an overpopulated country and there is a lot of land hunger. You never know the land which you will give to the people, whether it will be used for the particular purpose for which it has been given. So what I stress, what I think is that the land should remain with the government, but the forests or the trees which are being raised on that particular ground can be shared with the local villages. The profit out of that, if that exploitation or harvesting of those trees or any forest resource which is growing on that particular area, if that is to be harvested, the money which we get out of it, that can be shared with the local people. But if the land is given, I don't know, I'm not sure whether that will remain as such for the forest, or it can be used for tea stalls, say around the national highways, or it will be used for houses, or you never know.
गवर्नमेंट को तो वनीकरण का जितना भी कार्य है वो पब्लिक को दे देना चाहिए। जैसे महिला मंगल दल है, युवक मंगल दल है, ग्राम सभाएं हैं, और इन लोगों से गारंटी ले लेनी चाहिए कि इन जंगलों की रक्षा हम स्वयं करेंगे, और वो लोग इसको अपने आपस में बांटें। इसकी उपज जो होती है, जैसे चारा पत्ती है, इनमें यहाँ पर जो अच्छे अच्छे किस्म के चारे लाए जाएं, अच्छी गुणवत्ता वाले चारे हों, ताकि मवेशियों के लिए कुछ अच्छा खुराक मिल सके। इन चारागाहों में जो है वर्तमान में, उनमें जो है खादों का छिड़काव वगैरह किया जाए, ताकि अधिक से अधिक उपज मिल सके। और जैसे मलबरी है, सैतूत है, इसको खेतों की मेड़ों पे लगवाया जाए, ताकि सैतूत के कीड़े पाले जाएं, लोगों को पैसा मिले और उसकी तकनीकी समझाई जाए। तो इस तरह से अगर सरकार काम करेगी तो जंगल बनेंगे।
Meanwhile, in the scheme of things, where exactly will Chipko stand? Will it remain localized, coming as it does out of the specific historical and cultural experience of the peasantry of Garhwal and Kumaon? Or will it prove a source of inspiration in those parts of India which also suffer from ecological degradation?
I think it has achieved a great measure of success. One cannot, of course, for any movement say that, well, that's the end and, you know, it has achieved its objective. I think it has served in large measure to create consciousness among villagers and consciousness among the policymakers that we cannot deal with Himalayan forests and cannot ruthlessly exploit them for all time. That if we do so, that we are really asking for trouble.
Today, Chipko is regarded as an important ecological movement, resulting as a response to the country's forest crisis. The UP government, for one, has stopped the exploitation of forested areas up to 1,000 meters. But that alone is not enough. The primary focus should now be to protect and grow trees, to regenerate and revegetate the land, and rekindle the reverence man once had for nature, not just as a moral imperative, but because today it is essential for human survival.